Amira Hassan looked at her watch and felt her heart beat faster. She was already 15 minutes late for work, and her boss at the community center did not like it when people came late. The traffic on Main Street was moving very slowly today, and she could see a long line of cars ahead of her. She was a 19-year-old college student who worked part-time at the Riverside Community Center. The job was important to her because it helped her pay for school books and other things she needed. She also loved working there because she helped children with their homework and taught them about different cultures. The kids always smiled when they saw her, and their parents trusted her completely. Amira had been driving for 3 years and had never gotten a ticket. She was always careful to follow the rules of the road. Her father had taught her to drive, and he always told her that being a good driver was very important. He said that when you drive safely, you protect yourself and other people too. That Tuesday afternoon, Amira was driving her small blue car to work. She had just finished her last class of the day at the local college where she was studying to become a lawyer. She wanted to help people who needed legal help but could not afford it. Her dream was to work for people who faced unfair treatment because of their race, religion, or where they came from. The light ahead of her turned yellow when she was about 30 feet away from it. Amira knew she had to make a quick choice. She could try to stop, but she might not be able to stop in time. She could also keep going, because she was close enough to make it through safely. She looked at her speed and saw that she was going the speed limit. She decided to go through the light. Just as Amira drove through the intersection, she saw a police car on the side of the road. The officer inside the car was looking at the traffic light. Amira felt worried, but she told herself that she had done nothing wrong. She had gone through the light when it was still yellow, but then she saw the flashing lights behind her. The police car was following her, and the officer wanted her to stop. Amira felt scared and confused. She pulled over to the side of the road and waited for the officer to come to her car. Officer Martinez walked up to Amira's car window. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair, and he looked serious. Amira rolled down her window and said hello in a polite voice. She kept her hands on the steering wheel where the officer could see them, just like her father had taught her. "Good afternoon, miss," Officer Martinez said. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Amira thought carefully before she answered. "I think it might be about the traffic light back there," she said. "But I went through when the light was still yellow. I was close to the intersection, and I thought it was safer to keep going than to try to stop suddenly." Officer Martinez nodded but did not smile. "I saw you go through that light, and from where I was sitting it looked red to me. I need to see your driver's license, registration, and insurance card." Amira's hands shook a little as she got her papers from her purse in the glove box. She had never been stopped by the police before, and she felt nervous. She gave the officer her documents and waited while he looked at them. "Ms. Hassan," the officer said, reading from her license, "you have a clean driving record, which is good. But I still have to give you a ticket for running a red light. The fine is $250, or you can go to court if you want to fight it." Amira felt shocked. $250 was a lot of money for her. That was almost what she made in 2 weeks at her job. She also knew that she had not run a red light. She remembered clearly that the light was yellow when she went through it. "Officer Martinez," she said in a respectful voice, "I really believe the light was yellow when I went through it. Is there a camera at that intersection that might have recorded what happened?" The officer looked at her for a moment. "There is a traffic camera there," he said. "If you want to fight this ticket, you can request to see the camera footage in court. But I'm telling you what I saw, and I saw you go through a red light." Amira took the ticket from the officer and looked at it. She had 30 days to either pay the fine or go to court. She thanked Officer Martinez and drove away slowly, being extra careful to follow all the traffic rules. When she got to work, Amira was almost 30 minutes late. Her supervisor, Mrs. Johnson, was understanding when Amira explained what had happened. Mrs. Johnson had worked at the community center for 20 years and had seen many young people face difficult situations. "Don't worry about being late today," Mrs. Johnson said kindly. "These things happen. But what are you going to do about the ticket?" Amira had been thinking about that question since she left the police officer. "I think I'm going to fight it in court," she said. "I know I didn't run a red light, and if there's a camera, it should show the truth." That evening, Amira went home to the small apartment she shared with her parents and younger brother. Her family had moved to America from Jordan when she was 10 years old. They had worked hard to build a good life in their new country. Her father worked at a factory, and her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. They both wanted their children to get a good education and have better opportunities than they had. When Amira told her parents about the traffic ticket, they were worried. Her father, Ahmed, had always been afraid that his family might face unfair treatment because they were Muslim immigrants. He had heard stories of other families who had problems with the police or in court. "Maybe you should just pay the fine," her father said. "Going to court might cause more problems." But Amira's mother, Fatima, disagreed. "If Amira did nothing wrong, she should fight for what is right," her mother said. "We came to this country because we believed in justice and fairness. We should not be afraid to use the legal system when we need it." Amira spent the next few days thinking about what to do. She talked to some of her classmates at college, and most of them thought she should fight the ticket. One of her friends had fought a similar ticket and won because the traffic camera showed that she had not broken the law. 2 weeks after getting the ticket, Amira decided to go to court. She went to the courthouse and filled out the paperwork to request a hearing. The clerk told her that her court date would be in 6 weeks. The clerk also told her that she could request to see the traffic camera footage before her hearing. Amira felt nervous, but also excited. She had never been in a courtroom before, but she was studying to become a lawyer, so this would be good experience for her. She also felt confident that the camera footage would prove she was innocent. In the weeks before her court date, Amira prepared carefully. She researched traffic laws and learned about how traffic cameras worked. She also practiced what she would say to the judge. She wanted to be professional and respectful, but she also wanted to make sure the judge understood that she had done nothing wrong. The night before her court date, Amira could not sleep well. She kept thinking about what would happen the next day. She had never spoken to a judge before, and she was worried about making a mistake. But she also felt proud that she was standing up for herself and fighting for what was right. She chose her clothes carefully for court. She wanted to look professional and respectful. She picked a navy blue blazer and matching pants that her mother had bought for her for job interviews. She also chose a cream-colored hijab that matched her outfit nicely. Amira had been wearing hijab since she was 12 years old. It was an important part of her faith and her identity. She had never had any problems wearing it to school, work, or anywhere else. She felt comfortable and confident when she wore it, and it reminded her of her values and beliefs. As she got ready for court that morning, Amira felt ready to face whatever would happen. She believed in the American justice system, and she trusted that the truth would come out. She had no idea that her simple traffic ticket case was about to become something much bigger and more important than she ever imagined. The morning sun was bright as Amira and her father Ahmed walked toward the courthouse building. It was a big gray stone building with tall columns in front and many steps leading up to the main doors. Amira had driven past this building many times, but she had never been inside before. Ahmed had taken the whole day off from work to be with his daughter. He worked at a factory where they made car parts, and taking time off meant he would lose money from his paycheck. But he wanted to support Amira on this important day. He wore his best shirt and tie, and he had polished his shoes until they were shiny. "Remember," Ahmed said to his daughter as they walked up the steps, "be polite and respectful to everyone. Speak clearly and tell the truth. That is all you can do," Amira nodded. She felt nervous, but she also felt ready. She had spent weeks preparing for this day. She had copies of all her documents in a folder, and she had written notes about what she wanted to say to the judge. She had also requested the traffic camera footage from the intersection where she got the ticket. The courthouse was busy that morning. Many people were going in and out of the building. Some were dressed in business suits and others wore regular clothes. There were families with children, elderly people, and young people like Amira. Everyone seemed to be walking with purpose, like they had somewhere important to be. Inside the building, Amira and her father had to go through a security check. There were metal detectors and security guards just like at the airport. Amira put her purse and folder on the conveyor belt, and she walked through the metal detector. The security guard was friendly and smiled at her. "First time in court?" the guard asked. "Yes," Amira said. "I'm here to fight a traffic ticket." "Good luck," the guard said. "The traffic court is on the second floor, room 204. Amira and her father took the elevator to the second floor. The hallways were long and had many doors on both sides. There were signs on the walls that showed where different courtrooms were located. They found room 204 and saw that there was a long bench outside the door where people were sitting and waiting. A woman in a uniform was checking people's names on a list. She was the court clerk, and she helped people know when their cases would be called. Amira walked up to the clerk and gave her name. Hassan Amira, the clerk said, looking at her list. You're number 15 on the list today. The court starts at 9 o'clock, so you'll probably be called around 10:30 or 11. Amira and her father sat down on the bench to wait. Other people were waiting too, and Amira could hear some of them talking about their cases. Some people were there for speeding tickets, others for parking violations, and a few were there for more serious traffic problems. A young man sitting next to Amira was there because he had been caught using his phone while driving. An older woman was there because she had parked in a handicapped space without a permit. Everyone seemed nervous, just like Amira felt. At exactly 9 o'clock, the courtroom doors opened and people began to go inside. Amira and her father found seats in the back of the courtroom. The room was not very big, but it felt important and official. There were wooden benches for people to sit on, and at the front of the room was a large desk where the judge would sit. The walls were painted a light brown color, and there were pictures of former judges hanging on them. On one wall was a large American flag, and on the other wall was the state flag. Behind the judge's desk was a seal that showed the symbol of the court system. Amira looked around the room and counted about 20 other people waiting for their cases to be called. Some people had lawyers with them, but most people were representing themselves just like Amira was doing. She felt proud that she was handling her own case, but she also felt a little scared about speaking in front of the judge. At 9:15, a court officer came into the room and told everyone to stand up. Then Judge Richardson walked in through a door behind the big desk. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and glasses. He wore a black robe and looked very serious. He did not smile or look at the people in the courtroom. "Good morning," Judge Richardson said in a loud voice. "This is traffic court and we have a full schedule today. I expect everyone to be respectful and brief when presenting their cases. We will start with the first case on the list." The judge started calling cases and Amira watched carefully to see how things worked. Each person would walk up to a small table in front of the judge and state their name. Then the judge would read the charge against them and ask how they wanted to plead. Most people pleaded guilty and just paid their fines. A few people pleaded not guilty and tried to explain why they thought the ticket was wrong. Some of these people won their cases, but others lost and had to pay the fine anyway. Judge Richardson seemed to be in a hurry. He spoke quickly and did not spend much time listening to people's explanations. When someone tried to give a long story about why they were innocent, the judge would interrupt them and tell them to get to the point. Amira noticed that the judge was not very friendly or patient. He seemed annoyed when people took too long to speak, or when they did not understand the legal terms he used. This made Amira feel more nervous about her own case. As the morning went on, more people came into the courtroom. Some were lawyers who had multiple cases to handle. Others were people who were late for their court appointments. The room became crowded and it felt warm and stuffy. At 10:45, the court clerk called out, "Case number 2024 TR 1157, State versus Hassan Amira." Amira felt her heart start beating faster. This was it. She stood up from her seat and walked toward the front of the courtroom. Her father stayed in his seat, but he gave her an encouraging nod. As Amira walked to the defendant's table, she could feel people looking at her. She was wearing her navy blue blazer and matching pants, and her cream-colored hijab was arranged neatly around her head and shoulders. She felt professional and prepared. She placed her folder of documents on the table and stood quietly, waiting for the judge to speak to her. She could see that Judge Richardson was looking through some papers, probably reading about her case. The prosecutor, a young woman in a black suit, was also at a table near the front of the courtroom. She had a stack of files in front of her, and Amira's case was just one of many she would handle that day. "Ms. Hassan," Judge Richardson said, finally looking up from his papers, "you are charged with running a red light at the intersection of Main Street and Oak Avenue on Tuesday, March 15th, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. How do you plead?" Amira cleared her throat and spoke in a clear, strong voice. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge looked at her with a slightly surprised expression. Most people in traffic court pleaded guilty, especially for simple violations like running a red light. "Not guilty," the judge repeated. "I see. And do you have evidence to support your not guilty plea?" Yes, Your Honor, Amira said. I have requested the traffic camera footage from that intersection. I believe it will show that I went through the light while it was still yellow, not red. Judge Richardson looked through his papers again. I see that you did request the camera footage, he said. Has the prosecution provided this footage to you? The prosecutor stood up. Your Honor, we have the footage available and we're prepared to show it if necessary. Good, the judge said. But before we look at any evidence, I need to address something else. Amira waited, wondering what the judge was talking about. She thought everything was going well so far. Judge Richardson was looking directly at her now, and his expression had changed. He no longer looked bored or in a hurry. Instead, he looked focused and stern. Ms. Hassan, he said, I noticed that you are wearing a head covering in my courtroom. Amira felt confused. Of course she was wearing her hijab. She wore it everywhere she went. She did not understand why the judge was mentioning it. Yes, Your Honor, she said simply. Well, I need you to remove it, Judge Richardson said. Courtroom policy requires all head coverings to be removed for security and identification purposes. Amira felt like the floor had dropped out from under her feet. She could not believe what she was hearing. Remove her hijab in public? In front of all these strangers? She had never been asked to remove her hijab anywhere before. Not at school, not at work, not at the airport, not anywhere. Her hijab was not just a piece of clothing to her. It was part of her faith, part of who she was. Your Honor, Amira said, trying to keep her voice steady. My hijab is a religious covering. I wear it as part of my Islamic faith. Could I please request a religious accommodation? The judge's expression grew more stern. Ms. Hassan, I don't care what religion you are. In my courtroom, everyone follows the same rules. Security policy requires all headwear to be removed. Now please remove it so we can proceed with your case. Amira felt panic rising in her chest. She looked back at her father, who was leaning forward in his seat with a worried expression on his face. She looked around the courtroom and saw that everyone was staring at her. Some people looked curious, others looked uncomfortable. She had come to court to fight for what was right about her traffic ticket, but now she was facing a much bigger fight about her religious rights. She had to make a choice that would affect not just her case, but her values and beliefs as well. The courtroom was completely quiet as everyone waited to see what she would do. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy and uncomfortable. Amira stood at the defendant's table, her hands shaking slightly as she held onto her folder of documents. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do next. Judge Richardson sat behind his big wooden desk, looking down at her with an impatient expression. He tapped his pen against his papers, making a soft clicking sound that seemed very loud in the quiet room. Ms. Hassan, the judge said again, his voice sharper than before. I'm waiting for you to remove your head covering. This is not a request. This is an order from the court. Amira took a deep breath. She had practiced for weeks what she would say about her traffic ticket, but she had never imagined she would need to defend her right to wear her hijab in court. Her mind was racing as she tried to think of the right words to say. Your Honor, she began, trying to keep her voice calm and respectful. I understand that you have policies in your courtroom, but my hijab is not just a hat or a fashion choice. It is a religious covering that is required by my faith. I have never been asked to remove it anywhere else, including at the security checkpoint downstairs. Judge Richardson's face grew redder. Young lady, I don't care about your personal beliefs or what other places have allowed you to do. This is my courtroom, and in my courtroom I can see everyone's full face and head for identification and security reasons. Now remove it immediately, or I will hold you in contempt of court. Amira felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard the term contempt of court before in her pre-law classes, and she knew it was serious. People could be fined or even sent to jail for contempt of court. But she also knew that her constitutional rights were being violated. Your Honor, she said, her voice becoming stronger despite her fear, I respectfully request that you reconsider this order. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects my right to practice my religion freely. Federal law requires reasonable accommodation for religious practices, and wearing my hijab does not prevent you from identifying me. I showed my identification to multiple people before entering this courtroom. The judge slammed his hand down on his desk, making a loud noise that startled everyone in the room. Several people in the gallery jumped in their seats. Don't you dare lecture me about the law, young woman, Judge Richardson shouted. I have been a judge for 23 years. and I know the law better than some teenager who thinks she can come into my courtroom and make demands." Behind Amira, her father Ahmed started to stand up from his seat, but then sat back down. He looked very worried and upset, but he did not want to make the situation worse for his daughter. "Your Honor," Amira said, still trying to remain respectful despite the judge's anger, "I am not trying to lecture you or make demands. I am simply asking for the same religious accommodation that is protected by federal law and that has been recognized by courts across the country." Judge Richardson stood up from his chair, making himself look taller and more intimidating. His black robe made him look like a large, angry bird. "Federal law," he said with a sarcastic laugh. "Let me tell you about federal law, Ms. Hassan. Federal law says that judges have the authority to maintain order and security in their courtrooms. Federal law says that I can set reasonable rules for courtroom conduct, and my rule is that all head coverings must be removed." Amira noticed that some people in the courtroom were starting to whisper to each other. A few people were shaking their heads, looking like they disagreed with what the judge was saying. One older man in a suit who looked like he might be a lawyer was frowning and taking notes on a piece of paper. "But, Your Honor," Amira continued, "there are many court cases that have established that religious head coverings are different from regular hats or caps. Courts have consistently ruled that Muslim women cannot be forced to remove their hijabs in public settings, including courtrooms, unless there is a compelling security reason that cannot be addressed in any other way." The judge's anger seemed to be getting worse instead of better. "Are you a lawyer, Ms. Hassan?" he asked in a mocking tone. "No, Your Honor, I am a pre-law student, but I have studied constitutional law and I know that my rights are being violated." "Your rights?" Judge Richardson laughed again, but it was not a friendly laugh. "Your rights end where my courtroom begins. You want to exercise your rights? You can do that outside. In here you follow my rules or you face the consequences." Amira felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She did not want to cry in front of everyone. She needed to stay strong and keep fighting for what was right. "Your Honor," she said, "I have already been identified multiple times today. The security guards downstairs saw my face when I came through the metal detector. The court clerk checked my identification and saw my face. The prosecutor has seen my face. You have seen my face. There is no security reason to require me to remove my hijab." "Security is not the only reason," the judge said. "There is also the matter of respect for the court. When people come into my courtroom, they show respect by removing their hats and head coverings. It's about showing proper respect to the judicial system." "But, Your Honor," Amira replied, "wearing my hijab is how I show respect to God and to my faith. Asking me to remove it is asking me to choose between respecting the court and respecting my deeply held religious beliefs. That is exactly the kind of choice that the First Amendment was designed to prevent." By this time, more people in the courtroom were paying attention to what was happening. The case that was supposed to be about a simple traffic ticket had turned into something much more important. Some people in the gallery were recording the conversation with their phones, though they were trying to be discreet about it. The prosecutor, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally stood up. "Your Honor," she said, "if I may address the court." "What is it?" Judge Richardson asked, still looking angry. "Your Honor, I believe the defendant may have a valid point about religious accommodation. Perhaps we could find a way to proceed that would address the court's concerns while also respecting the defendant's religious practices." Judge Richardson turned his angry gaze toward the prosecutor. "Ms. Garcia, your job is to prosecute traffic violations, not to give legal advice to defendants about their supposed constitutional rights." The prosecutor sat back down, but Amira could see that she looked uncomfortable with the judge's response. An older man in a gray suit who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "may I approach the bench?" "Who are you?" Judge Richardson asked. "My name is Robert Chen and I am a practicing attorney. I am not representing anyone in this case, but I am observing these proceedings and I believe there may be some legal issues that the court should consider." "Sit down, Mr. Chen," the judge said firmly. "This is not your case and your input is not needed or wanted." The lawyer sat down, but he continued to take notes and look very concerned about what was happening. Judge Richardson turned his attention back to Amira. "Ms. Hassan, I have been patient with you, but my patience is running out. I am going to give you one final opportunity to comply with the court's order. Remove your head covering now or I will hold you in contempt and you will spend the night in jail." Amira felt like the whole world was watching her at that moment. She thought about her parents, who had worked so hard to build a good life in America. She thought about her dreams of becoming a lawyer and helping other people who faced unfair treatment. She thought about all the other Muslim women who might face the same situation in the future. But most of all, she thought about her faith and her values. Her hijab was not just a piece of cloth. It represented her commitment to her beliefs and her identity as a Muslim woman. Taking it off in front of all these strangers would feel like losing a part of herself. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her fear. "I cannot and will not remove my hijab. My religious beliefs are too important to me, and I believe that my constitutional rights protect me from being forced to make this choice." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. Some people nodded in approval of Amira's courage, while others looked shocked that she had defied the judge's direct order. Judge Richardson's face was now very red, and his hands were shaking with anger. "Very well, Ms. Hassan. You have made your choice. Bailiff, place this defendant under arrest for contempt of court." The bailiff, a large man in a uniform, looked uncertain. He glanced around the courtroom and seemed uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. "Your Honor," the bailiff said quietly. "Are you sure about this? Maybe we should—" "I said arrest her," Judge Richardson shouted. "She has willfully disobeyed a direct order from this court, and she must be held accountable for her actions." As the bailiff slowly walked toward Amira, several people in the courtroom started to stand up. The lawyer who had tried to speak earlier was on his feet again, and he was speaking urgently into his cell phone. Other people were also making phone calls or sending text messages. Amira stood very still as the bailiff approached her. She was scared, but she was also proud of herself for standing up for her beliefs. She had no idea that her simple traffic ticket case was about to become a national news story that would change her life forever. The bailiff walked slowly toward Amira, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet courtroom. His name was Officer Johnson, and he had worked in the courthouse for 12 years. In all that time, he had never been asked to arrest someone for refusing to remove religious clothing. Officer Johnson stopped when he reached Amira's table. He looked at her, then looked back at Judge Richardson, then looked at Amira again. The young woman was standing very straight and tall, even though he could see that her hands were shaking. Her father was half standing in his seat, looking like he wanted to run to his daughter but did not know what to do. "Miss," Officer Johnson said quietly to Amira, "are you sure you don't want to just remove your head covering? This could all be over in a few seconds if you just do what the judge asked." Amira looked up at the bailiff with sad but determined eyes. "Officer, I understand that you are trying to help me and I appreciate that, but I cannot remove my hijab. It would be like asking me to remove part of my soul." Officer Johnson had worked with many people over the years, and he had learned to tell when someone was lying or just causing trouble for attention. But when he looked at Amira, he could see that she was sincere. This was not a game to her. This was about something very deep and important in her life. "Your Honor," Officer Johnson said, turning back toward the judge, "perhaps we could find another solution here. Maybe the young lady could partially lift her covering just enough to show her full face and then put it back down." Judge Richardson slammed his hand on his desk again. "Officer Johnson, I did not ask for your opinion on how to handle this situation. I gave you a direct order to arrest this defendant for contempt of court. Now do your job." The courtroom was buzzing with quiet conversations. People were whispering to each other and pointing at what was happening. Several people had their phones out and were clearly recording everything that was taking place. A woman in the third row stood up. She was wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase. "Your Honor," she called out, "my name is Jennifer Walsh and I am an attorney. I would like to request permission to speak on behalf of constitutional law regarding this matter." "Sit down," Judge Richardson shouted. "I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus. This is a simple matter of courtroom procedure, and it does not require input from every lawyer who happens to be sitting in the gallery." But Ms. Walsh did not sit down. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is not a simple matter of courtroom procedure. This is a clear violation of the First Amendment rights of this defendant. Courts across the nation have consistently ruled that forcing a Muslim woman to remove her hijab without a compelling security reason is unconstitutional." "Bailiff," Judge Richardson yelled, now standing up and pointing at Ms. Walsh. "If that woman does not sit down and be quiet immediately, arrest her too for disrupting my court." Officer Johnson looked very uncomfortable. He was trained to follow orders from judges, but he was also trained to uphold the law and protect people's rights. He had never been in a situation where these two duties seemed to conflict with each other. Another man in the courtroom stood up. He was older, maybe in his 60s, and he was wearing a military uniform with medals on his chest. Your Honor, I am retired Colonel Michael Thompson, and I served this country for 30 years defending the Constitution. What I am seeing here today goes against everything that America stands for. Sit down, Colonel, or you will be arrested too, the judge shouted. But now other people were starting to stand up as well. A young woman with a small child, an elderly couple, a man in work clothes, and several others were all on their feet. They were not shouting or being disruptive, but they were clearly showing their support for Amira by standing up. Amira looked around the courtroom and felt overwhelmed by emotion. These were complete strangers who did not know her, but they were willing to risk getting in trouble themselves to support her rights. She had never experienced anything like this before. Her father Ahmed was now fully standing with tears in his eyes. He was proud of his daughter for standing up for what was right, but he was also terrified about what might happen to her. Your Honor, Amira said, her voice now stronger and clearer than it had been all morning. I want to say something to the court. You have said quite enough already. Ms. Hassan, Judge Richardson replied angrily. Please, Your Honor, just let me speak for one moment. The judge paused, perhaps realizing that the situation in his courtroom was getting out of his control. Fine, you have 30 seconds. Amira took a deep breath and looked around the room at all the people who were supporting her. Then she looked directly at Judge Richardson. Your Honor, I came to this courtroom today to fight a traffic ticket because I believed I was innocent and I wanted the truth to be heard. I never expected to have to fight for my religious freedom. But that is exactly what America is about. The right to stand up for what we believe in, even when it is difficult. She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. My family came to this country when I was 10 years old because we believed in the American promise of freedom and justice for all people, regardless of their religion or where they come from. My parents have worked hard every day to build a good life here, and they have taught me to respect the law and the Constitution. Judge Richardson was listening but still looked very angry. I am not trying to disrespect your court or the legal system. Your Honor, I have great respect for the law, which is why I am studying to become a lawyer myself. But I also have great respect for the Constitution, which protects my right to practice my religion freely. When you ask me to choose between respecting the court and respecting my faith, you are asking me to give up one of the most fundamental rights that makes America special. Several people in the courtroom started to clap softly, but Amira raised her hand to ask them to stop. I know that you have the power to send me to jail, Your Honor, but I also know that I am right about the law and I am right about my rights. If standing up for the Constitution means going to jail, then I am prepared to do that. But I will not remove my hijab, because doing so would be betraying everything that I believe in and everything that America represents. When Amira finished speaking, the courtroom was completely silent for several long seconds. Even Judge Richardson seemed to be thinking about what she had said. The prosecutor, Ms. Garcia, stood up again. Your Honor, if I may make a suggestion, perhaps we could take a short recess so that all parties can consider the legal implications of this situation. There may be precedents and laws that should be researched before we proceed. I don't need a recess to know what the law is in my own courtroom, Judge Richardson snapped. But then he noticed that the court reporter, the person whose job it was to write down everything that happened in court, had stopped typing and was staring at him with a worried expression. He also noticed that several people in the gallery were clearly recording everything with their phones. Judge Richardson realized that whatever he did next would be seen and heard by many people outside his courtroom. Word of this incident would spread quickly, and his actions would be judged by other judges, lawyers, and the general public. The lawyer named Robert Chen stood up again. Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to cite some recent court cases that are directly relevant to this situation. I already told you to sit down, Mr. Chen. Yes, Your Honor, but in the case of United States versus Board of Education for the School District of Philadelphia, the Third Circuit Court of Appeal specifically ruled that forcing a Muslim woman to remove her hijab without a compelling government interest that cannot be served in a less restrictive way violates the First Amendment. And in the case of Freeman versus State of Florida, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that Enough, Judge Richardson shouted. I don't care about cases from other courts. I care about maintaining order in my courtroom. Officer Johnson, who had been standing next to Amira this whole time without arresting her, finally spoke up. Your Honor, I've been thinking about this situation and I have some concerns about the legality of arresting someone for exercising their constitutional rights. Maybe we should contact the Chief Judge before we proceed. Judge Richardson looked at his bailiff with shock and anger. Officer Johnson, you work for this court and you follow my orders. I am ordering you to arrest this defendant right now. Officer Johnson looked at Amira, then at all the people standing in the courtroom, then back at Judge Richardson. He had to make a choice between following an order that he believed was wrong and doing what he thought was right. Your Honor, Officer Johnson said slowly, I need to ask you to reconsider this order. I don't think arresting this young woman is the right thing to do. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. A bailiff refusing to follow a judge's order was almost unheard of. But Officer Johnson had worked in law enforcement for 20 years before coming to the courthouse, and his training had taught him that his first duty was to uphold the Constitution, not to follow illegal orders. Judge Richardson's face was now bright red with anger and embarrassment. He had lost control of his courtroom. His bailiff was refusing to follow his orders, and dozens of people were recording everything that happened. Fine, he shouted. If you won't do your job, I'll find someone who will. Within 30 minutes of the first news report, the story of Amira Hassan and her confrontation with Judge Richardson had spread across social media platforms like wildfire. Videos taken by people in the courtroom were being shared thousands of times on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The hashtag #StandWithAmira was trending nationally. Sarah Mitchell, the television reporter, was broadcasting live updates every few minutes as the situation continued to develop. What started as a simple traffic court hearing has become a major constitutional rights case, she reported to her viewers. A 19-year-old Muslim college student is facing jail time for refusing to remove her religious head covering in court. At the national headquarters of the Council on American-Islamic Relations in Washington, D.C., the phone was ringing constantly. CAIR was a civil rights organization that worked to protect the rights of Muslim Americans and to educate the public about Islam. Fatima al-Rashid, the legal director of CAIR, was watching the live news coverage on her computer while fielding phone calls from reporters and concerned citizens. She had been working in civil rights law for 15 years, and she had seen many cases of discrimination against Muslim women who wore hijab. But she had never seen a case quite like this one. This is exactly the kind of religious discrimination that we work to prevent, Ms. al-Rashid said to her assistant. Get me the best constitutional lawyer we have on our staff, and book me on the next flight to wherever this courthouse is located. We need to be there immediately. At the same time, the American Civil Liberties Union was also mobilizing its resources. The ACLU was one of the oldest and most respected civil rights organizations in the country, and they had a long history of defending religious freedom for people of all faiths. David Rodriguez, the ACLU's Director of Religious Liberty, was also watching the news coverage with great concern. This judge is clearly violating this young woman's First Amendment rights, he said to his legal team. We need to file an emergency motion immediately to stop this arrest and to protect her constitutional rights. Both CAIR and the ACLU began working frantically to provide legal help to Amira. Their lawyers were researching legal precedents, preparing court documents, and making travel arrangements to get to the courthouse as quickly as possible. Back in courtroom 204, the situation was becoming more tense and chaotic by the minute. More reporters had arrived, and the gallery was now packed with journalists, lawyers, activists, and curious citizens who had heard about the story on social media. Judge Richardson was feeling increasingly overwhelmed and angry about losing control of his courtroom. He had never had to deal with this kind of media attention and public scrutiny before. Most of his cases involved simple traffic violations and minor disputes that nobody cared about, except the people directly involved. Clear this courtroom immediately, Judge Richardson shouted at the reporters and spectators. Everyone except the defendant and court personnel must leave right now. But the reporters knew their rights. Sarah Mitchell stood up and spoke directly to the judge. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a public courtroom and these are public proceedings. The First Amendment protects our right to observe and report on what happens in court. I don't care what the First Amendment says. Judge Richardson replied angrily. "This is my courtroom and I decide who can stay and who must leave." Robert Chen, the lawyer who had been trying to help from the gallery, shook his head sadly. "Your Honor, you are now violating not only the defendant's First Amendment rights to religious freedom, but also the press's First Amendment rights to free speech and freedom of the press." Judge Richardson turned his angry gaze toward Mr. Chen. "That's it. Bailiff, arrest that man for contempt of court as well." But Officer Johnson, who was still standing next to Amira, did not move to arrest anyone. "Your Honor, I really think we need to wait for guidance from the Chief Judge before we arrest anyone else." At that moment, the courtroom doors opened again, and a woman in an expensive black suit walked in quickly, followed by two younger people carrying briefcases and legal documents. The woman was Sarah Martinez, one of the most respected religious rights attorneys in the country. She worked for a large law firm that specialized in constitutional law, and she had won many important cases involving religious freedom. "Your Honor," Ms. Martinez called out as she walked toward the front of the courtroom. "My name is Sarah Martinez and I am an attorney. I am here to represent Ms. Amira Hassan in this matter." Judge Richardson looked at the new attorney with suspicion and frustration. "I did not give you permission to enter my courtroom or to represent anyone in this case." "Your Honor, I don't need your permission to represent someone whose constitutional rights are being violated," Ms. Martinez replied calmly but firmly. "Ms. Hassan has the right to legal counsel under the Sixth Amendment, and I am here to provide that counsel." Ms. Martinez walked over to where Amira was standing and introduced herself quietly. "Ms. Hassan, my name is Sarah Martinez and I'm here to help you. The Council on American Islamic Relations and the American Civil Liberties Union have sent me to represent you free of charge." Amira felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the past hour she had been standing alone against Judge Richardson's orders, with only the support of the people in the gallery. Now she had an experienced lawyer who knew how to fight for her rights. "Thank you so much," Amira whispered to Ms. Martinez. "I was so scared and I didn't know what to do." Ms. Martinez opened her briefcase and pulled out several legal documents. "Your Honor, I am filing an emergency motion to dismiss any contempt charges against my client. The court's order requiring her to remove her hijab violates the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act." Judge Richardson looked at the thick stack of legal papers that Ms. Martinez was holding. He was beginning to realize that this situation had grown far beyond his ability to handle it alone. Furthermore, Ms. Martinez continued, "I am requesting an immediate stay of any arrest order while these constitutional issues are resolved through the proper legal channels." The lawyer opened another folder and began reading from a legal document. "In the case of Muhammad versus Enterprise Leasing Company, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that forcing a Muslim woman to remove her hijab without a compelling governmental interest violates her constitutional rights. In the case of Webb versus City of Philadelphia, the Third Circuit ruled that religious accommodations must be made unless they create an undue burden on the government entity." Judge Richardson was listening to all these legal citations, but he was also noticing that more lawyers were entering his courtroom. It seemed like every few minutes another attorney was walking in with briefcases and legal documents. One of the new arrivals was James Wilson, a lawyer from the local chapter of the ACLU. Behind him was Imam Abdullah Hassan from the largest mosque in the city, who had come to provide spiritual support to Amira. The imam was a tall, elderly man with a gray beard and kind eyes. He had been the religious leader of his community for 25 years, and he had helped many Muslim families deal with discrimination and prejudice. "Your Honor," Imam Hassan said respectfully, "I am here as a religious leader to explain the importance of hijab in the Islamic faith. For Muslim women like Ms. Hassan, wearing hijab is not a choice or a fashion statement. It is a religious obligation that is central to their relationship with God." Judge Richardson was feeling more and more overwhelmed by all the lawyers, religious leaders, reporters, and activists who had invaded his usually quiet traffic court. He had expected to spend the morning hearing simple cases about speeding tickets and parking violations. Instead, he was dealing with constitutional law, media attention, and national controversy. His phone was ringing constantly with calls from court administrators, other judges, and reporters wanting to know what was happening in his courtroom. His secretary had stopped coming into the courtroom because she was too busy. answering phone calls and dealing with people who were arriving at the courthouse. Sarah Martinez approached the bench with her legal documents. Your Honor, I am formally requesting that all contempt charges against my client be dropped immediately. The law is very clear that government officials cannot force people to violate their religious beliefs unless there is a compelling governmental interest that cannot be achieved in a less restrictive way. She handed him a thick folder full of court cases and legal precedents. These cases all support my client's position that she has the constitutional right to wear her hijab in court. There is no security concern that would justify forcing her to remove it, especially since she has already been properly identified multiple times. Judge Richardson took the folder but did not open it. He was staring out at his courtroom, which was now packed with people and buzzing with activity. Television cameras were recording everything he said and did. Lawyers were filing motions and citing constitutional amendments. Religious leaders were explaining Islamic law. Reporters were asking questions and broadcasting live updates. This was not the quiet, controlled environment that he was used to. He had built his career on being the absolute authority in his courtroom, but Judge Richardson walked to the side of his courtroom where he could speak privately on the phone, while still keeping an eye on everything that was happening. Chief Judge Williams was the head of the entire court district, and she was Judge Richardson's boss. When she called, he had to answer. Hello, Chief Judge Williams, Judge Richardson said, trying to keep his voice calm despite all the chaos around him. Richard, Chief Judge Williams said, using his first name in a way that immediately told him he was in serious trouble. What in the world is going on in your courtroom? I've got reporters calling me, civil rights lawyers filing emergency motions, and videos of your court proceedings being broadcast on national television. Judge Richardson looked out at his courtroom, which was still packed with lawyers, reporters, activists, and spectators. The scene looked like something from a movie rather than a quiet traffic court hearing. Chief Judge, I was simply trying to enforce courtroom security policies, he said defensively. The defendant refused to follow a direct order to remove her head covering, and I held her in contempt of court. There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Chief Judge Williams was a woman in her 50s who had been a judge for 20 years and had earned a reputation for being fair, intelligent, and deeply knowledgeable about the law. Richard, she said finally, have you reviewed our district's written policies on religious accommodations? Judge Richardson felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. I was applying general courtroom security procedures, he said, not really answering her question. Richard, I'm going to read something to you, Chief Judge Williams said. This is from our official district policy manual, Section 4.2. Religious head coverings, including but not limited to hijabs, yarmulkes, turbans, and other faith-based garments, are permitted in all courtrooms unless there is a specific security concern that cannot be addressed through alternative means. Did you follow this policy? Judge Richardson felt his face getting hot. He had been so focused on asserting his authority that he had not bothered to check the written policies that governed his own court. Was concerned about identification and security, he said weakly. Richard, according to the court clerk's notes, this defendant was properly identified multiple times before entering the courtroom. According to the bailiff's report, which I just received, there was no security concern whatsoever. You simply ordered her to remove her hijab because you didn't want her wearing it in your court. Judge Richardson could hear the anger and disappointment in Chief Judge Williams's voice. He realized that his actions were being reviewed and documented by multiple people, and the evidence was not supporting his position. Furthermore, Chief Judge Williams continued, I have just finished reading several legal briefs that have been filed in the past hour by the ACLU, CARE, and other organizations. They have cited numerous federal court decisions that directly contradict your actions today. You have created a serious legal liability for this entire court system. While Judge Richardson was having this phone conversation, more developments were taking place in the courtroom. Sarah Martinez, Amira's lawyer, was speaking with reporters and explaining the legal issues involved in the case. What we're seeing here is a clear violation of the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom, Ms. Martinez told the cameras. Muslim women have the constitutional right to wear hijab in courtrooms, schools, workplaces, and all other public spaces. This right has been established by decades of court decisions. One of the reporters asked Ms. Martinez about what would happen next. We are filing emergency motions in federal court to protect Ms. Hassan's rights, and to prevent this kind of discrimination from happening to other Muslim women in the future, she replied. At the same time, Imam Abdullah Hassan was speaking with other religious leaders who had arrived to show support for Amira. There were Christian ministers, Jewish rabbis, Hindu priests, and Buddhist monks who had come to the courthouse because they understood that an attack on one person's religious freedom was an attack on everyone's religious freedom. This is not just about Islam, Imam Hassan explained to a group of reporters. This is about the fundamental American principle that government cannot force people to violate their religious beliefs. If it can happen to a Muslim woman today, it can happen to a Jewish man tomorrow, or a Christian woman next week. Rabbi Sarah Goldman, who led a large synagogue in the city, nodded in agreement. Throughout history, religious minorities have faced discrimination and persecution. America was founded on the principle that this kind of persecution would not be tolerated here. Reverend Michael Johnson, a Baptist minister, added, "The First Amendment protects all of us, regardless of our faith. When we stand up for one person's religious rights, we are protecting the religious rights of all Americans." Back at the phone, Chief Judge Williams was delivering more bad news to Judge Richardson. "Richard, I have been contacted by the State Judicial Commission, the Federal District Court, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. This case is now being reviewed at the highest levels of the legal system." Judge Richardson felt like his world was collapsing around him. What had started as a routine morning in traffic court was now a national incident that could end his career. "What do you want me to do, Chief Judge?" he asked quietly. "First, you are going to dismiss all contempt charges against Ms. Hassan immediately. Second, you are going to issue a public apology for violating her constitutional rights. Third, you're going to complete mandatory training on civil rights law and religious accommodation policies." Judge Richardson looked out at Amira, who was still standing at the defendant's table with her lawyer. She had remained calm and dignified throughout the entire ordeal, even when faced with the threat of arrest and jail time. "And Richard," Chief Judge Williams continued, "you need to understand that your actions today have damaged not only your own reputation, but the reputation of our entire court system. Judges are supposed to protect people's constitutional rights, not violate them." When Judge Richardson finished his phone call, he walked back to his bench slowly. The courtroom was still buzzing with activity, but people noticed that the judge looked different now. His angry, defiant expression had been replaced by something that looked like worry and regret. Sarah Martinez approached the bench with her legal documents. "Your Honor, we are prepared to argue our motions regarding my client's constitutional rights." Judge Richardson looked down at his desk for a long moment. He was thinking about his 23 years as a judge and how he had always prided himself on running a fair and orderly courtroom. But today he had allowed his personal feelings to override the law and the Constitution. "Ms. Martinez," he said finally, "before we proceed with any motions, I need to make a statement to the court." The crowded courtroom became quiet as everyone waited to hear what Judge Richardson would say. Amira looked up at the judge, still wearing her cream-colored hijab and still holding her folder of documents about her traffic ticket. "Ms. Hassan," Judge Richardson said, looking directly at Amira, "I owe you an apology. After reviewing the applicable laws and court policies, I realized that my order requiring you to remove your hijab was wrong. You have the constitutional right to wear your religious covering in this courtroom, and I should have respected that right from the beginning." The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs of surprise and relief. Amira felt tears of gratitude forming in her eyes, but she blinked them back and maintained her composure. "Furthermore," Judge Richardson continued, "I am dismissing all contempt charges against you. You were standing up for your constitutional rights, and that is exactly what American citizens should do when faced with government overreach." Sarah Martinez smiled and put her hand on Amira's shoulder. "Thank you, Your Honor. We appreciate your recognition of my client's rights." But Judge Richardson was not finished. "Ms. Hassan, I also want you to know that your original traffic citation is being dismissed as well. After witnessing your courage and integrity today, I have no doubt that you are a person of strong character who would not deliberately violate traffic laws." Amira finally allowed herself to smile. After hours of stress and fear, she was finally free to go home. But more importantly, she had helped establish an important precedent for religious freedom that would protect other Muslim women in the future. The Reporters in the courtroom immediately began broadcasting the news of Judge Richardson's reversal. Within minutes, the story was spreading across social media and news websites. Judge apologizes to Muslim student, dismisses all charges. As Amira walked out of the courtroom with her father and her lawyer, she had no idea that her courageous stand was about to change not just her own life, but the lives of countless other people who believed in religious freedom and constitutional rights. 6 months after that memorable day in courtroom 204, Amira Hassan was sitting in her dormitory room at the State University, surrounded by law school application materials and acceptance letters. The small room was decorated with photos of her family, inspirational quotes, and certificates of recognition she had received from various civil rights organizations. The thick envelope in her hands bore the seal of Harvard Law School, one of the most prestigious legal institutions in the country. With trembling fingers, she opened the letter and read the words she had dreamed of seeing. "Congratulations. We are pleased to offer you admission to Harvard Law School, along with a full scholarship for your outstanding commitment to civil rights and constitutional law." Amira set the letter down carefully and looked at herself in the mirror across the room. She was still wearing hijab, just as she had been that day in court. But now when she looked at herself, she saw something different. She saw a young woman who had stood up for her beliefs and had made a difference in the world. The months following her court case had been like a whirlwind. Within days of Judge Richardson's apology and dismissal of charges, Amira's story had been featured on national television news programs, in major newspapers, and in magazines across the country. She had received thousands of letters and emails from people all over America and around the world, thanking her for standing up for religious freedom. But the most amazing outcome was not the media attention or the recognition. It was the real changes that had resulted from her courageous stand in court that day. Chief Judge Williams had acted quickly to implement new policies throughout the entire court district. Every courthouse now had clear written guidelines posted at the entrances explaining that religious head coverings were welcome and protected by law. All judges and court personnel were required to complete training courses on religious accommodation and constitutional rights. The training program had been developed with help from legal experts, religious leaders from many different faiths and civil rights organizations. Judge Richardson himself had become one of the most effective advocates for the program, speaking to other judges about the importance of understanding and respecting religious diversity. "I learned a valuable lesson that day," Judge Richardson had said in a speech to a conference of state judges. "I let my personal biases and my desire for control override my duty to protect the constitutional rights of the people who come before me. Every judge needs to remember that we serve the Constitution first and our own opinions second." The changes had spread far beyond just that one court district. When news of Amira's case reached other states, many court systems began reviewing their own policies on religious accommodation. The case had been cited in legal briefs and court decisions across the country, establishing important precedents for religious freedom rights. The Council on American Islamic Relations had used Amira's case as an example in their educational programs, teaching Muslim Americans about their rights and showing them how to stand up against discrimination. The American Civil Liberties Union had included her story in their training materials for lawyers who work on religious freedom cases. Sarah Martinez, the lawyer who had represented Amira, had been so impressed by the young woman's courage and intelligence that she had offered her a summer internship at her law firm. Amira had spent the summer learning about constitutional law and working on other religious freedom cases. "Amira has a natural instinct for justice," Ms. Martinez had told the partners at her law firm. "She understands that the law is not just about rules and procedures. It's about protecting people's fundamental rights and dignity." During her internship, Amira had helped with several cases involving religious discrimination. She had worked on a case where a Sikh man was fired from his job because he refused to remove his turban. She had assisted with a case where a Jewish student was not allowed to miss school for religious holidays. She had researched legal precedents for a case where a Christian nurse was disciplined for wearing a cross necklace at work. Through all of this work, Amira had learned that her experience in court was not unique. Many people face discrimination because of their religious beliefs, and many of them did not have the courage or the resources to fight back. This realization had strengthened her determination to become a civil rights lawyer, but the impact of Amira's case went beyond just legal changes. Her story had inspired many other young people, especially young Muslim women, to stand up for their rights and to pursue their dreams despite facing prejudice and discrimination. Fatima al-Rashid from Caire had started a scholarship program for Muslim students who wanted to study law, and she had named it the Amira Hassan Scholarship for Religious Freedom. The first recipient was a young woman from California who had been discriminated against at her high school for wearing hijab. Amira showed us that one person can make a difference, Ms. al-Rashid had said at the scholarship ceremony. She proved that when you stand up for what is right, other people will stand with you, and together you can create change. Amira had also become a sought-after speaker at universities, high schools, and community organizations. She had spoken at conferences on religious freedom, women's rights, and constitutional law. Her message was always the same. Every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their religion, race, or background. At one speaking engagement at a local high school, a young Muslim girl had approached Amira after her presentation. The girl was wearing hijab and looked nervous as she spoke. "Ms. Hassan," the girl had said quietly, "some kids at my school make fun of me because I wear hijab. They tell me to go back to my own country, even though I was born here in America. After hearing your story, I feel stronger. I know that I don't have to be ashamed of who I am." Moments like this reminded Amira why her stand in court had been so important. It was not just about her own rights, but about the rights of every American to practice their religion freely and to be treated equally under the law. Her parents, Ahmed and Fatima, had watched their daughter's transformation with pride and amazement. The shy college student who had been scared to speak up in class had become a confident young woman who was comfortable speaking to audiences of hundreds of people. When we came to America 30 years ago, we dreamed that our children would have opportunities that we never had, Ahmed had said in an interview with a local newspaper. But we never imagined that our daughter would help make America a better place for everyone. Amira's younger brother had also been affected by his sister's experience. He had decided to study journalism so that he could help tell the stories of people who face discrimination and injustice. "My sister showed me that you can change the world by standing up for what is right," he had said. The original traffic ticket that had started everything had been completely forgotten in the midst of all the attention on religious freedom rights. But Amira often thought about how different her life might have been if she had just paid the fine instead of going to court that day. "Everything happens for a reason," she had told a reporter. "I thought I was going to court to fight a traffic ticket, but God had bigger plans for me." Sometimes the most difficult moments in our lives turn out to be the most important ones. As she prepared for law school, Amira was already making plans for her career. She wanted to work for a civil rights organization, helping people who face discrimination because of their religion, race, or other characteristics. She dreamed of arguing cases before the Supreme Court and of helping to shape the laws that protect everyone's constitutional rights. Judge Richardson had also undergone his own transformation. After completing his mandatory training on civil rights and religious accommodation, he had become an advocate for judicial education on these issues. He had spoken at conferences and had written articles for legal journals about the importance of protecting religious freedom in courtrooms. "Ms. Hassan taught me that being a good judge means more than just following procedures," he had written in one article. "It means protecting the rights and dignity of every person who comes before you, even when you don't understand or agree with their beliefs." The courtroom where everything had happened had also been changed. A plaque had been installed near the entrance that read, "Religious freedom is protected in this court. All persons have the right to practice their faith without interference from the government." On the anniversary of her court case, Amira had returned to courtroom 204 with her parents and Sarah Martinez. The room looked the same, but it felt completely different. Instead of being a place where her rights had been violated, it had become a symbol of how the American legal system could correct its mistakes and protect constitutional rights. As Amira packed her belongings for her move to Harvard Law School, she reflected on the amazing journey that had started with a simple traffic ticket. She had learned that courage was not about not being afraid, but about doing what was right even when you were afraid. She had learned that standing up for your own rights often means standing up for everyone's rights. Most importantly, she had learned that in America, even when the system fails, there are ways to make it work better. The Constitution was not just Judge Richardson picked up his phone with shaking hands and dialed the number for courthouse security. His face was still bright red and sweat was starting to form on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning in the courtroom. "This is Judge Richardson in courtroom 204, he said into the phone, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I need additional security officers here immediately. I have a defendant who is refusing to comply with court orders, and my bailiff is not following my instructions." While the judge was making his phone call, more people in the courtroom were standing up. What had started with just a few supporters had now grown to include most of the people in the gallery. They were not making noise or causing a disturbance, but their silent support for Amira was clear and powerful. Amira looked around at all these strangers who were risking getting in trouble themselves just to support her rights. She felt grateful but also worried. She did not want other people to get arrested because of her situation. "Please," she said, speaking to the people in the gallery, "please sit down. I don't want anyone else to get in trouble because of me." But an older woman in the front row shook her head. "Sweetheart," she said with a kind voice, "when someone's rights are being violated, it becomes everyone's responsibility to stand up and be counted." The woman's name was Dorothy Martinez, and she was 73 years old. She had been a civil rights activist in the 1960s and had participated in many peaceful protests for equal rights. She knew what it looked like when someone was being treated unfairly because of who they were. "I have seen this kind of thing before," Mrs. Martinez said, loud enough for the judge to hear her. "When people in power try to force others to give up their beliefs and their identity. This is exactly what we fought against 50 years ago." Judge Richardson finished his phone call and turned his attention back to the courtroom. "Everyone sit down immediately," he shouted. "Anyone who remains standing will be held in contempt of court along with the defendant." But instead of sitting down, even more people stood up. The retired Colonel Thompson was still standing, as were the lawyer Jennifer Walsh and several others. A young mother with a baby in her arms stood up. An elderly man with a walking cane struggled to his feet. A teenager who looked like he might be a high school student stood up next to his parents. The scene in the courtroom was unlike anything Judge Richardson had ever experienced in his 23 years on the bench. He was used to people being afraid of him and following his orders without question. But now he faced a room full of people who were willing to risk arrest rather than watch someone's constitutional rights be violated. Officer Johnson was still standing next to Amira, but he had not made any move to arrest her. He was looking around the courtroom with amazement at what was happening. In his years of working in law enforcement, he had learned to recognize the difference between troublemakers who just wanted to cause problems and regular citizens who were genuinely standing up for what was right. The courtroom door opened, and two more security officers came in. They were Officer Davis and Officer Peterson, and they worked for the courthouse security department. Judge Richardson waved them over. "Officers," the judge said, "I need you to arrest the defendant for contempt of court. She has refused to follow a direct order from this court, and she must be taken into custody immediately." Officer Davis looked at Amira, who was still standing quietly at her table with her folder of documents. She did not look like a dangerous criminal. She looked like a scared young woman who was trying to do what she thought was right. "What exactly did she do, Your Honor?" Officer Davis asked. "She refused to remove her head covering when ordered to do so by this court," Judge Richardson replied. Officer Davis and Officer Peterson looked at each other. They had both worked in courthouse security for several years, and they had dealt with many difficult situations. But they had never been asked to arrest someone for wearing religious clothing. "Your Honor," Officer Davis said carefully, "we might need to check with our supervisor before we make an arrest on these grounds. There could be legal issues that we need to consider." Judge Richardson was becoming more frustrated by the minute. First, his bailiff had refused to follow his orders, and now the security officers were questioning him too. "I am ordering you to make this arrest," the judge shouted. "I don't care what legal issues you think there might be. I am the judge in this courtroom, and when I give an order, it must be followed." While this conversation was happening, the lawyer Robert Chen had been making phone calls on his cell phone. He had contacted several civil rights organizations and legal aid societies to let them know what was happening in the courtroom. "Your Honor," Mr. Chen called out, "I have just spoken with attorneys from the American Civil Liberties Union and the Council on American Islamic Relations. They are sending lawyers here immediately to represent this young woman. I don't care who you called or who is coming. Judge Richardson replied. This matter will be resolved right now in this courtroom according to my orders. But even as the judge was speaking, more people were arriving at the courthouse. News of what was happening had spread quickly through social media and text messages. Lawyers, activists, reporters, and ordinary citizens who cared about religious freedom were making their way to courtroom 204. Amira's father, Ahmed, was still standing in his seat, watching everything with worry and pride. He was worried about what might happen to his daughter, but he was also proud that she was standing up for her beliefs and her rights, just like he and his wife had taught her to do. Ahmed thought about the day 29 years ago, when he and his wife Fatima had first arrived in America with their young son and their dreams of a better life. They had believed that America was a place where people could practice their religion freely and where everyone was treated equally under the law. Over the years, Ahmed had sometimes wondered if they had made the right choice in coming to America. There had been difficult times when people had treated them badly because they were Muslim immigrants. But watching his daughter stand up for her rights in an American courtroom made him feel proud to be an American. Judge Richardson looked at the two security officers who were still hesitating to arrest Amira. Officers, I am giving you a direct order for the final time. Arrest this defendant immediately, or I will have you both reported for failing to perform your duties. Officer Peterson stepped forward. Your Honor, I think we need to call the Chief Judge before we proceed with this arrest. This situation involves constitutional rights, and I don't want to make a mistake that could cause problems for everyone involved. The Chief Judge? Judge Richardson laughed bitterly. I don't need permission from the Chief Judge to maintain order in my own courtroom. I am the presiding judge here, and what I say goes. But Officer Peterson was already reaching for his radio to contact his supervisor. This is Peterson in courtroom 204. We need the Chief Judge contacted immediately. We have a situation here that requires higher-level review. The voice that came back over the radio was calm but concerned. Understood, Peterson. Chief Judge Williams is being notified right now. Do not take any action until you receive further instructions. Judge Richardson heard the radio conversation, and his anger reached a new level. Officers, I am holding you both in contempt of court as well. Everyone in this room seems to think they can ignore my authority and do whatever they want. But Officer Davis shook his head. Your Honor, we follow orders from our chain of command, and our chain of command is telling us to wait for the Chief Judge. We're going to wait. The lawyer, Jennifer Walsh, who was still standing in the gallery, spoke up again. Your Honor, what is happening here is going to be reviewed by higher courts, and your actions today will be judged against constitutional law and legal precedent. I strongly urge you to reconsider your position before this situation gets worse. Worse? Judge Richardson said with a bitter laugh. How could this situation possibly get worse? As if in answer to his question, the courtroom doors opened again and a group of people with cameras and microphones walked in. They were reporters from local television stations and newspapers who had heard about what was happening and had come to cover the story. One of the reporters, a woman with blonde hair wearing a red blazer, immediately began filming with a small camera, while her partner set up a larger camera on a tripod. This is Sarah Mitchell reporting live from Courthouse 204, where a Muslim college student is facing arrest for refusing to remove her hijab in court, the reporter said into her microphone. Judge Richardson looked at the reporters with shock and horror. The last thing he wanted was for this situation to be broadcast on television and reported in newspapers. He realized that his handling of this case was about to become public knowledge, and he began to worry about how it would affect his reputation and his career. No cameras in my courtroom, he shouted at the reporters. This is a closed hearing. But Sarah Mitchell had done her research before coming to the courthouse. Your Honor, traffic court hearings are public proceedings under state law. The press has a right to observe and report on what happens here. As more reporters arrived and set up their equipment, Judge Richardson realized that his simple traffic court was now the center of a media